Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta. Welcome to my show. Thank you for joining me today on this Wednesday morning. Today we are going to be taking a look at a passage from Isaiah chapter 9, which is a very debated topic, especially when it comes from opponents of the Israel exclusive view that I've been presenting over the past few months. This teaching and audio was kind of spurred by a friend of mine, reaching out to me and asking me what I thought about the passage, and saying that on Facebook there are those who believe that this single passage single-handedly takes down the mountain, and I mean Everest-sized mountain of evidence, which suggests that my view is correct here. And it's funny because people will use the full preterist passages, for example, all of the time statements, and there are many. They'll use all of these dozens upon dozens of time statements to sort of bury the futurist point of view and mindset, because of course there are far more time statements that favor the full preterist paradigm than the futurist, and it's not even close. And they'll be the ones to say, look, we have 100 examples of why you're wrong, and you're clinging to 2 or 3 and saying that, no, you're right because of those 2 or 3. Well, the same is true here. We have full preterists who are really being inconsistent, is really what it is, inconsistent preterism. And they are clinging to a couple passages such as Isaiah 9:7, which they've got entirely wrong, which I'm going to show here shortly, such as Ephesians 3:21. And there's really not that many others. I think those are probably the only 2 that they can appeal to make it seem as though, hey, look, you guys missed this, haha. But the truth of the matter is that no, we haven't missed it. In fact, we've tackled it head on, and that's why I wanted to kind of explain it today, based on how I see it. But before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about a quote that someone sent to me, and the quote comes from Dr. Don Preston, and the quote is, I guess, from a Facebook interaction that Mr. Preston was involved in. I don't know how recent, but I just received the quote today, and people have been getting, I guess, on him, if you will, or sort of badgering him a little bit to get involved in all of this. And for those of you who have followed me on Facebook, months ago when I was on there, you probably recall that people were tagging him and William Bell and Larry Siegel on many of my posts, and just basically begging them to step in and sort of save the day. And when they did this, the few times that they did, what they really did is they ignored the arguments that I was making in order to present page after page after page of ongoing babble of arguments that are totally unrelated to the points that I'm bringing up. For instance, I would basically ask them, okay, well, the Bible says that salvation was, for sins committed under the first covenant, and that Christ's death was for transgressions under that first covenant. So therefore, how do you, Mr. Don Preston, how do you today need salvation? And since the judgment occurred 2,000 years ago, the only judgment that the Bible speaks of that was about to take place, how therefore then are you being judged today at your death? And, these types of questions would be totally ignored, and instead they would come back with 10 or 12 points. And when I say points, I mean paragraphs for each point, in an effort to sort of bury the argument and, smoke screen it away. And this was getting very frustrating for me and for others. And I recall many people messaging me saying, it's kind of frustrating how they just won't answer your questions, and instead they, blast you with tons of information. That's like an information overload. And they do this because they understand the implications of the view that I'm presenting and others are presenting to them, and they understand that there's a lot that rides on this. If indeed this is true and it gains any sort of following or momentum, which It won't, because people would rather not accept the truth about it, just like futurists would rather not accept the truth of full preterism. There's levels to this stuff. The full preterist doesn't want to take the conclusions to their obvious logical conclusion. But if in fact it did ever happen, then they would be entirely in trouble, because as you know, a lot of their support comes from books and teachings and their ministry and such, and their personal lives would take a big hit. So I'm not bashing the character of these men per se, but it is involved, and I can assure you of that. They would blast me with these ongoing useless ramblings, and they never really accomplished much, because people were left very unsatisfied by their answers. Anyways, today I got this message from something that Dr. Don Preston said, and I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to notice how grossly misrepresented my view, and those who agree with me on this, how grossly wrong he is about representing what we actually believe. He says this: some have, however, sadly denied that God ever intended to save pagans, anyone not of the 12 tribes of Israel. They claim that Gentiles, the word, in the Old Testament scriptures refers to the 10 northern tribes that were swallowed up by the nations, and thus, somehow, some way, the 10 tribes became, from that point forward, the exclusive referent in the word Gentiles, nations, ethnoi, he puts in parentheses. And then he says, this is patently wrong and an abuse of Scripture. Well, there's just so many problems with what Dr. Preston says there. First of all, none of it's really true. He basically builds a straw man argument with this statement. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to play on the heartstrings of those who are looking to him for help with this view. And so he misrepresents everything that we believe in. So he essentially lies in that statement and says that we believe that every single time that the word Gentile, or in the Old Testament, goy, every single time that word is used in the Old Testament, he states that we believe it always speaks of scattered Israelites. I mean, how ridiculously silly is that argument? And anybody with any common sense or any kind of knowledge, or brain for that matter, would know that what he says in this quote, verbatim, I just read it to you, is completely false. For instance, in Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 6, God is the prophet is talking about the judgment against Jerusalem, and he says this: "Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the midst of the nations and the countries all around her." Okay, she has rebelled against my judgments, and by doing wickedness more than the nations. All right, so clearly in this passage here, the word goy is not pertaining to the elect diaspora, nor would we ever suggest it was. That is just ridiculous. Another example is Jeremiah 5:15, which states, "Behold, I will bring a nation against you from afar, O house of Israel, says the Lord. It is a mighty nation, it is an ancient nation, a nation whose language you do not know, nor can you understand what they say, and they shall eat up your harvest and bread," blah, blah, blah. Clearly, we know that the word goy here for nation is clearly the same word that's used for Gentile, by the way, because again, as I've been saying, the word Gentile is oftentimes just simply meaning people out in the nations. But the point is that in no way would anyone in my camp ever interpret this word as scattered elect Israelites. The bottom line here is that his statement is a straw man argument. He builds it up, he sets it ablaze, so that he can kind of appeal to those who are desperately hoping for something to refute this truth that's been being presented lately. And they'll buy into this deception and dishonesty with hopes that this is the argument that sort of clears it out or puts this view to bed, when in fact it's nothing more than a deceptive, dishonest statement. Context drives the meaning, okay, always, and he wouldn't disagree with that, even though his statement here seems to suggest that I would disagree with that. In the context of the conversions and the salvation of the church people and the church members that we see in the last days in the New Testament, yes, indeed, the Gentiles, which simply means people outside of the commonwealth of Israel, were indeed the elect diaspora. It's not hard to see. For those of you who have been following my teachings, you've clearly seen it. For those of you who have listened to 6 of the last 7 of my audios that I've shared on my channel, I've outlined very clearly, very specifically who the Ephesians, who the Romans, who the Corinthians, who the Galatians, who the Colossians, and who the Thessalonian churches were. Now, those were all supposedly foreign outside churches, but yet in my teachings, I show handily how the text within each letter proves specifically and clearly and undeniably that the recipients of those letters were, as Peter called them in the nations, the elect diaspora. All right, it's for instance in Colossians 2, where Paul tells them that they were dead in their trespasses and sins and in the uncircumcision of their flesh. That makes no sense if he's indeed writing to pagans, because pagans were never commanded to be circumcised in the flesh of their foreskin. That was a covenant commandment given to Israel. But yet, he ignores these things, and others ignore these things to press forward in their interpretation. Well, again, like I said, Peter says it very clearly. James says it very clearly. Paul says it more times than we can even count, and in so many ways that you really don't even catch them all, because you have to be familiar with the language and the references that he makes. And oh yeah, that guy, what's his name? Jesus Christ. Yeah, he said it too. I come only for the lost sheep of Israel. All right, and it's just funny how they'll deny such clear things. And really all we're seeing here in the New Testament in these conversions is that the shepherd was seeking out his lost sheep. That's what a shepherd does. It seeks lost sheep. It tends to lost sheep. Sheep in the Old Testament was never anybody beyond the covenant people of God. Therefore, the sheep in the New Testament did not change. That's called God changing, which Mr. Preston likes to say, God does not change. Well, if God doesn't change, then the sheep in the New Testament were the same as the sheep in the Old, my friend. But anyways, enough about that. We're going to get to the topic at hand today, which seems to be confusing to a lot of people. It comes from Isaiah chapter 9, and I'm just going to read the passage real quick, and then we're going to kind of loop around and show you what this really means. In verse 7, he says this, of the increase, well, let me back up, verse 6, just so we can get the full context here, because you're going to note that a child was given to a specific people, and that government was tied to them. He says in verse 6, for unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So before we get into explaining what I believe Isaiah is stating here, we're going to look at some other passages to kind of set a little foundation here. In Romans chapter 11, what we need to read is the portion that confuses everybody, really. Preston and others have written books on these 2 verses, literally books, when in fact it's actually quite easy. In verse 25, Paul reads this. Paul states this to the Romans. Who, by the way, he's already defined for us 2 verses prior in Romans chapter 9 when he asks rhetorically, also of the Gentiles. He says, he answers that he sort of pulls from the Old Testament and says, I will call them my people who are not my people, and my beloved who are not my beloved. In the place that it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. Well, that comes from Hosea 1. And if you look at that portion in Hosea 1, it's all about God bringing back the scattered Israelites who had been dispersed into the nations. And although they had become like the sand of the sea, the remnant of them would be brought back and saved. So Paul reveals himself and tells us exactly who the Gentiles were in focus. And again, Gentiles does not mean a specific class of people like you would think. It just simply means those in the nations, those outside of the commonwealth of Israel, the parameters of Israel, if you will. Okay, so Paul establishes that for us 2 chapters earlier, so we already know who the Gentiles were. Paul was not speaking of 2 different types of converted Gentiles in his letters. He speaks of one. And we know from Peter's letter that who they were. They were the elect diaspora, whom, by the way, he says in 2 Peter 3, Paul also wrote to about the same things that Peter was writing to. So Paul wrote to them as well. But he says this in Romans 11:25. He says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Okay, for this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." So in verse 25, we read, "For I do not desire brethren." Now remember, 2 chapters prior in Romans 9, Paul defines who his brethren were. He says that the brethren were his countrymen. They were Israelites. Okay. He says that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel. All right, now why is he saying that if indeed he's writing to the elect diaspora here, the elect Israelites out in the nations? Well, because he's speaking of Israel in the flesh. He's speaking of the Jews. He's speaking of those of the circumcision party, okay? And he's saying, and because to these whom he's writing to out in Rome, they would have indeed looked upon the Jews as Israel, because of course they lived in Israel. I mean, it's pretty simple here. These whom he was writing to lived in Rome, the area of Rome. So they were Roman, if you will. They were Gentile, which simply, again, just means those out in the nations. So when he says blindness in part has happened to Israel, he's speaking more about the geographic location and those that live there, okay? And he says until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. In other words, that blindness has happened to them until the fullness of you guys out in the nations, you elect diaspora, you scattered Israelites who are out here in the nations who are being called back, you sheep who the shepherd is calling back, until the fullness of you has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. So in other words, the blindness had happened so that the fullness of those in the nations, the fullness of the sheep, like remember when Jesus says, I'm not going to really look it up, but he says something about, I have sheep that are not of this fold, he tells them. I have other sheep not of this fold. In other words, he's speaking to Jews, telling them that he has other sheep not of this fold. The other sheep were the diaspora, the scattered ones that were out in the nations, and they were going to be brought back too, as Paul went out to them. But the point here is that the blindness had happened to Israel until the fullness of those ones in the nations had come in. And so it would result in all Israel being saved. All right, all the true Israel of God. And so all Israel will be saved as it is written. And then he quotes an Old Testament portion from Isaiah 59, which is all about Israel, by the way. And he says this, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. All right, note Jacob, okay? Jacob is Israel, all right? All of us know that. It's just another name. But Jacob was going to be the one whom the ungodliness would be turned away from here, all right? And then Paul says in verse 27, as a sort of a conclusionary statement, he says, quoting from Isaiah, he says, "For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." So Jacob was going to have the ungodliness taken away. Jacob was going to have the covenant made with them, and Jacob's sins were going to be taken away. So Jacob is the kingdom, okay? And what you have to understand here is that unless the fullness of the Gentiles has already come in, then there is no new covenant, and the sins have not been taken away. The new covenant that was going to be made with Jacob and the removal of Jacob's sins hinged upon the fact that all Israel would be saved, because it wasn't going to be until that point, when all Israel was saved, that the deliverer would come out of Zion and he would make his covenant with them and remove their sins, okay? This is what Hebrews, I believe, 9:26 states, when he died once for sins, but he would return apart from sin for salvation. So he was, it had already begun, but he was going to complete it when he came out of Zion. But notice there that the fullness of the Gentiles had to come in before all Israel was saved. Now, this is just a dagger to the heart of anyone who thinks that there is an ongoing kingdom today that is spoken of in the Bible. It makes absolutely zero sense whatsoever to have a fullness of the Gentiles that needed to come in to contribute to and to finish off Israel's sins being removed. Okay? And again, get your mind trained to understand Gentile in the sense of those in the nations, not a class of people. All right, so when he says the fullness of the Gentiles will come in, and so all Israel will be saved, he's basically saying that, hey, look, the fullness of the Gentiles must come in order for all Israel to be saved. It doesn't work without them. They have to come in. There was an elect remnant. There was a total number. We see this in Revelation where God would not harm anybody until all of them were sealed on the forehead. All right, so the fullness of the Gentiles was a real fullness. It wasn't some qualitative nonsense that someone had once mentioned to me. But the fullness of those Gentiles must have come in before the end. And it was at that point then that God would turn away ungodliness from Jacob and establish his covenant with them and take away their sins. So that whole concept of us being spiritual Israel today is just false. Like Don Preston would say, it's patently false, okay? And the reason is because, first of all, the term isn't even anywhere in the Bible. Go look for the term spiritual Israel in the Bible. You will not find it, okay? You'll find the true Israel of God, which simply just, again, proves my point that there was an Israel within the totality of Israel. There was a remnant within Israel, like Paul in Romans 4 says, I'm paraphrasing again, but he says that, the promise wasn't coming to Abraham's seed through the law, but through faith. In other words, the promise was still limited to Abraham's seed. It just wasn't coming through the law. It was coming to those of faith that were his seed. So again, the point here is that spiritual Israel and that idea and that name and that term is nowhere to be found in the Bible. And also consider the fact that these true Israel of God, these true Israelites of God, were being added during those last days. And all of them had to come in and be saved before the end. That was the whole point. That was why the mission, the gospel mission, was urgent. And that's why it went out to the ends of the land. And that's why there was an end coming, okay? So spiritual Israel is false. It's not true. There's nowhere in the Bible. I used to believe it. I used to think that we're spiritual Israel today. It doesn't work. All Israel was already saved, aka Jacob was already saved. Remember that. Jacob and Israel, interchangeable here, okay? Jacob was the remnant. Jacob was the elect. Remember back in Romans 9 where Paul talks about Jacob and Esau. He says before they had come out of the womb, before having done anything good or bad, God already had chosen Jacob. And Jacob had he loved and Esau had he hated. So Jacob was the chosen ones of God. They were the remnant. So Jacob had his sins taken away, and the covenant was with Jacob, all right? The totality of Jacob. Now, the other passage we need to go to is Luke chapter 1, because Luke chapter 1 defines who the kingdom was. All right, in Luke chapter 1, verse 29 and forward, it says this, "But when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and considered what manner of greeting this was. Then the angel said to her, 'Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David.'" Ready for this? Verse 33. "And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end." All right, so who's the kingdom? Clearly the kingdom here is Jacob. All right, and clearly Jacob would stand forever and Jacob would have no end because Jacob is the kingdom. All right, so, but look what he says. He says, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son." Well, remember Isaiah chapter 9 says, "For unto us a son is born, and the government will be on his shoulders." Well, again, in verse 33 here of Luke, we see that Jesus would reign, that's rule, that's government, over the house of Jacob forever, and of Jacob, the kingdom, there will be no end. So Jacob was the kingdom, okay? That's very simple, very plain. And of Jacob, there would be no end. All right. Another passage we're going to look at is Acts chapter 1. Now, even the Jews understood that the kingdom was promised. This new kingdom was a promise to Israel. Look what they say in, verse 6. It says, "Therefore, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, 'Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?' And he said to them, 'It is not for you to know the times or seasons which the Father has put in his own authority.'" All right, so again, even the Jews understood that the kingdom was going to be restored to who? To all of us today, pagans, Americans? No, to Israel. All right, pretty clear there. And then Daniel chapter 2, another good one. When the prophet is talking about the everlasting kingdom down in verse 44, he goes through the kingdoms, and he comes to verse 44 and he says this. Excuse me. He says, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom, ready, shall not be left to other people. All right, so it says it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So key word there is this kingdom would not be left to other people. What does that say? You know, does that sound like an ongoing kingdom where people are going to continuously come in? Of course it doesn't. And when we combine that with the fact that we know that the fullness of Israel and the fullness of the Gentiles was already saved before the end, and that all Israel was saved, and that Jacob was the kingdom, and Jacob was saved in full, and all of Jacob's sins were forgiven, that's a total statement. That's a conclusive statement. If Jacob's sins were already forgiven, then you and I are not Jacob today. It just doesn't work that way. And remember, Jacob is Israel. So you and I are not Israel today, okay? Because Jacob's sins were already removed, all right? You and I are not having sins removed today as some spiritual form of Jacob. It's just totally unbiblical. And that's coming from a guy who believed it once. So we've sort of given you a few passages that show, exactly, number one, who the kingdom was. It was Jacob. Number two, that Jacob's sins were already completely forgiven and the new covenant was already completely established, and that the fullness of the Gentiles, aka those in the nations, had already all come in. So there's no ongoing concept there. They were all saved. So who's being saved today? Who's Israel today? Who's Jacob today? Whose sins need forgiveness today when the law, every jot and tittle passed away, and the law was the curse, like Paul said? It just doesn't work. So and then you couple that with the fact that the Jews in Acts 1 thought that the kingdom was being restored to Israel as well as Daniel in chapter 2 speaking of this never-ending eternal kingdom and that it would not be left to other people. That's because God was calling them all in. It was the end of the age. You see, people don't understand the time statements of the gospel. What I mean by that is they don't look at the fact that Jesus said, "Lo, I will be with you until the end of the age." And that he said, go and preach the gospel to the ends of the land, and then the end will come. All right, these are conclusion statements. These are not ongoing statements, but we ignore them, and we say that it's an eternal thing because of our misunderstanding of what's being done here, number one, and that God was calling his people back to him. And we also misunderstand the fact of what salvation actually is in the biblical sense. We botched the law. Jesus was the end of the law. He fulfilled the law. Was that meaning that he was the end of a moral law, or he was fulfilling a moral law written on the heart? Of course not. That means that he fulfilled and finished a literal codified law given to a literal people. All right, so just a lot of problems that people have, and they don't realize it. And so they come to this passage in Isaiah 9, and they look at it, and they say, see, this one passage right here, this takes down the preponderance of evidence that's against us. And it's just funny because if they're looking at the whole chapter, number one, the chapter is all about Israel. All right, it's not about anybody else. But number two, they're ignoring all of this work that I've done and that others have done in demonstrating who these converts were in the New Testament with the 6 audios I just mentioned, where I basically outline every foreign church in the New Testament besides the Philippians, which is just the letter that doesn't really have much in it to suggest that I should say it doesn't have much proof in it, but that's not to state that he wasn't writing to them. It's just to state that his topics and his focus was on other things, not so much as on, defining who they were, where they came from, why they needed salvation. We just get a very small piece of the story. We don't see it all. I'm convinced that there's numerous writings that we have no clue even existed, because Paul is basically writing to the Romans and saying Abraham our father. So these Romans already knew that they were descendants of Abraham, but Paul doesn't have to mention that and explain that because it's already been outlined in one of the previous decades before the letter actually got to them. So that's just the whole point. But in Isaiah 9, we're going to kind of read a little bit about this, and we're going to take some notes, all right? So in Isaiah 9, verse 3, a few verses before the verse in question, we have to understand that, something is said here, and our translations don't really do a good job with this. But if you look at the King James Version, All right, and you look at it as Isaiah 9, verse 3, it reads this. Thou hast multiplied the nation, okay, speaking of Israel. And then he says this, he says, and not increased the joy. All right, so that's key, because the English version and the New King James, they leave out the word not. It just says, and increased the joy. But the actual translation is, thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. And then he says, they joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. In other words, to me, what it's saying is that Israel had no true joy. All right, the joy that they got was according to the harvest, and they rejoiced as men rejoice when they divide the spoils, or they divide wealth, or whatever. So, in other words, it's not peace, it's not joy, it's sort of vanity. But then he goes on and he says, for thou hast broken the yoke of his burden, and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. He says, for every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. Now listen to this. In verse 6, he says this, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. So who's the us in context? Nobody would deny it's Israel. All right, like in the Gospels, it says he came to his own, and for God so loved the world. That's all about Israel. But the point is that he's saying, unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given. That's the son is Christ. The son was given to them. All right, it doesn't say unto us and the world and the pagans a son was given. No, it's specific to them. And look what he says, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Well, what government? What was the reign that's in focus here? Well, he was the king of his kingdom, wasn't he? So the government that was going to be upon his shoulder was the kingdom, which we've previously defined from the Bible was Jacob, and whom we've previously defined and proved conclusively that all of Jacob was forgiven already. All of Jacob was saved, meaning all Israel was saved when the fullness of those nations came in, those out in the nations that needed to be redeemed. So the government that is in focus here, that was given to them through the Son, was the kingdom, which is Jacob. All right? And he says, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. Now here's verse 7, which throws people all off. And it says, of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David, and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Well, we need to really look at the word increase here, all right? The word for increase is the Hebrew word H4766, and it's marbeh, M-A-R-B-E-H, okay? It's a masculine noun here. And the number one definition of this is simply abundance, all right? It's increase is a secondary definition, but the number one definition of this is abundance, or greatness would be another word, okay? So when we look at this as the best definition being abundance, and we substitute that in, you can see that it takes a different tone or a different meaning. It says, of the abundance of his kingdom and peace there shall be no end. Now remember, what Isaiah is doing here is he's contrasting the future promises to Jacob, to the kingdom, that they would have peace, that there would be no more tears, that there would be no more death, that they would have everlasting peace and joy, and because all throughout Israel's history they were attacked, they were devoured by these beasts of the field, says Ezekiel. They were cast out to the nations and sent away by God in judgment. They had a pretty rough go of it. If you read their history, I mean, they were basically abused and treated harshly by many nations. Okay. But the point that what Isaiah is trying to do here is he's basically contrasting that and saying, this government that's going to come by way of our Redeemer, who's given to us, its abundance and its peace will never end. Okay, meaning that, for instance, when Isaiah speaks of those who sacked Jerusalem, he speaks of it as they have taken, actually what he's doing is he's kind of comparing it to their future prosperity. And he says, no longer will you plant and another man eat. No longer will you build and another inhabit. In other words, they were constantly being invaded, ransacked, thieved, whatever you want to call it. So what Isaiah is doing is he's saying, of the abundance of his government and peace, there'll be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, which we already know from other places who the kingdom was. Okay, the kingdom didn't change here. It was Jacob. He says to order it and to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. All right, so again, Isaiah is comparing the fact that they had been treated harshly, that their history was one of sorrow and one of many bad happenings that occurred with their judgments and being scattered and being ransacked and cities being burnt down and whatnot. And this is just basically a promise that the kingdom that they were promised, which would come by way of their Redeemer, would be abundant. It would be peaceful. It would be joyful, and it would have no end. Okay, which again ties back into Luke 1, which talks about Jacob being the everlasting kingdom, and of Jacob there would be no end. All right, so Jacob is the kingdom, and if Jacob was already saved and all Jacob's sins were forgiven already per Romans 11, then you and I are not Jacob today. All right, it just doesn't work. So, but look back at verse 3. He says, thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. Well, go to verse 7. After he's talking about the oppression and the lack of joy, lack of true joy that Israel had as a people, he then gets in a few verses later and says, for unto us a child is born. He'll be called Wonderful, the Counselor, the Prince of Peace. And of the increase or of the abundance of his government and peace, there'll be no end. So again, it's just a contrast to Israel's history of what they went through versus what was coming for them, for the elect, for the righteous. So, and we know that this is the case because it's only used in one other place, that word marba. And the other place it's used is Isaiah 33:23, which reads this, thy tacklings are loosed, they could not well strengthen their mast, they could not spread the sail. Then is the prey of a great spoil divided, the lame take the prey. So the word for great there is marba, same word that's used in Isaiah 9:7. And here it's simply just greatness or abundant spoil. In other words, a massive spoil. So again, increase is sort of the wrong idea there. But it can work based on the fact that just 4 verses prior, it talks about that they did not have an increase of joy. But then, in Isaiah 9:7, it says, of the increase of his new covenant, this new government that was going to come by way of their Redeemer, there'll be no end. And there'll be no end to the peace of that government. So he's just playing one off the other. But in no way, shape, or form does this mean that people today are spiritual Jacob or spiritual Israel coming into that kingdom, which, by the way, Daniel says was not going to be left to other people. So it just, it all ties in. But really what you really got to consider here, and this is kind of like the cherry on top, if you will. If everything that I'm saying is true about what was going on in those last days, in other words, if God was skipping over and overlooking all the pagans in these nations, and he was specifically calling his people back. In other words, if the shepherd was specifically calling the sheep back, okay? And if the sheep didn't change, if the definition of a sheep did not change from the Old Testament into the New, okay? And if that is consistent, and everything that I've shown in all of my audios from the 6 foreign church audios that I just did, if you haven't listened to them, please do. Romans, Colossians, Ephesians, Galatians, Corinthians, and Thessalonians. I prove, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, I prove pretty well, if not undeniably, that these, in fact, were the elect diaspora, like Peter refers to them in 1 Peter chapter 1. So if that is the case, okay, now listen, if that is the case, and what I'm saying is correct, and God was overlooking everybody in those last days and only calling his people in, then what kind of implications does this have on these people who say, we are entering into the kingdom today? In other words, does it make any sense whatsoever for God to overlook everybody and focus solely on his elect, his remnant, okay, calling them back and nobody further, And then all of a sudden at AD 70, that changes, and now God is somehow allowing pagans and people that are not associated with the story, he's allowing them in. It doesn't make sense. If it can be proved that those in the New Testament were in fact pagan people and people not associated with the covenant, people that were not dead in the uncircumcision of their flesh and so on, if it can be proved that that is the case, then you have an argument because, okay, now you have real foreigners coming in. So it leaves the door open and the possibility open that it continues on today, even though you still have a problem if that is the case, because guess what? The fullness of the Gentiles had to come in before the end. So let's say that I'm wrong, which I'm not, but let's say that I'm wrong, and that the Gentiles that were being saved were actually pagan people, all right? People not associated with Israel. Guess what? The pagan Gentiles, as you would call them, had to be saved in full. The fullness of them had to come in order for all Israel to be saved. And that had to happen by the end of the age. Otherwise, there's no new covenant and Jacob's sins weren't taken away. Go read Romans 11, 25 to 27. That hinged upon the fullness of the Gentiles coming in. So even if these were pagan people, all right, and foreigners, true foreigners, the fullness of them already came in. It had to have. And therefore, there's no valid argument to state that it continues on today, because nobody's a Gentile today. What's a Gentile? It's someone foreign to Judaism. Well, Judaism in the biblical sense is gone. It's no longer a thing. It's God destroyed that in full when the temple fell 2,000 years ago. So no one is a Gentile today by definition, because that was a designation given to those outside of the covenants and the confines of Judaism. So again, the implications of this demand that the kingdom was specifically for them. The fullness of the Gentiles has come in, resulting in all Israel being saved. Paul defines those Gentiles 2 chapters earlier in Romans 9 as the not my people of Hosea 1, who were the scattered elect diaspora, who were being brought back, the sheep out in the nations who were being gathered in and herded in by their shepherd. And these were the sheep that were not of the fold of Judea and the Jews. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about that passage. I know that one comes up a lot. There is another sort of direction that I feel it can go, and I'm still kind of looking into it. It's not concrete yet, although it really doesn't change the fact that the story ended at all. Actually, it's still perfectly in line with that. But there is another avenue that I feel like that may be able to be worked out, but it's going to take a lot more development, and I'm going to have to really feel good about it to present it. And right now I don't. So right now, this collection of evidence that I just presented to you, to me, seems ironclad. And one thing to remember too is, an everlasting kingdom, like the Bible calls it a few times, like Ephesians 3:21, they'll worship him age unending. It still works fine for my position, because my position is that God took his bride, okay, at the end of the age. They were caught up together with him. Like Paul says, he says, those of us who are alive and remain will not precede those who are asleep. All right, so in what manner were they going to precede? And how was that going to work? I mean, it doesn't make any sense unless they were actually being taken and removed somewhere. We know from numerous passages that when this would happen, they would be like him. I'm not like him today. I don't know about you. I'm still in a mortal body that's going to die. They were going to marvel at him. They were going to see him. They were going to be caught up together with him, where they would forever be with the Lord, and so on and so forth. So there's tons of proof for an actual calling away or a snatching away, which is the direction that I'm going in, and works very clearly with and in line with everything else I'm seeing. And eventually I'll do some teachings on that, but I want to, develop some things first. But the point is that if in fact this kingdom was Jacob, and if in fact Jacob was delivered back to the Father, like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, after the destruction occurred, the kingdom would be delivered back to the Father. Then the age unending and the everlasting nature of the kingdom of Jacob works just fine. And there is nothing there that would affect my interpretation of what's going on here. But anyways, appreciate you guys giving this a listen. I hope you all have a wonderful Wednesday, and we will be back sometime soon with another fun episode of the show with